Hello and welcome to another episode of Fully Charged, this time coming from lovely sunny Chippenham in Wiltshire. I've come here to see a company called Good Energy. Now they're an electricity supplier, you can buy your electricity from Good Energy, but some of the innovative infrastructure things they're doing at the moment are really exciting and I can't wait to find out more.
Oh boy, this is going to be good.
So Julia, thank you for a start, giving us the time to talk to you today. I'm very excited about this because it's fascinating what you're doing. So wires are confusing, electricity is confusing. So where does the electricity come from? When you're a Good Energy customer and you turn a light on?
Before Juliet Davenport starts her story about waves and bumps and electrons, let me show you where your electricity almost certainly comes from, unless you've severed your connection to the grid. Coal, gas, biomass, oil, hydro, nuclear, wind and solar.
So electricity is all about vibration. So when you switch on a power station, essentially electrons don't flow from one end of the wire to the other. What they do is they vibrate and then they knock into their mates and they vibrate. So essentially what you get is a set of vibrations going down. They pass the message on.
Right.
Think about it like that. So actually saying which message is coming from where is really quite complicated. So we don't do that. What we do is we simplify it. So we have a bunch of customers who we plug into the end of the wires. We have a bunch of small generators. We work with about 1,500 small generators across the UK.
Right.
We plug them in, and what we promise is that for every unit our customers use, our generators will generate a unit.
Here things get tricky. The problem with this system is that you buy coal, gas and biomass energy. Regardless whether your kilowatt hour used will eventually get generated by a renewable energy source. This fact is due to the intermittency of renewables. The sun doesn't always shine when you are using your electricity. Neither does the wind always blow when you are using electricity. It is quite possible that neither of those will be available at a point where you are using electricity. This conundrum will never be solved, even with batteries or other forms of storage. So this promise of 1 kilowatt hour used means 1 kilowatt hour of green energy produced is cute. But in practice it hardly means anything because your energy will come from gas, coal or biomass regardless whether you choose to or not.
So we create that kind of marketplace essentially. Because eventually you could see a world where people generate more of their power themselves, and actually maybe you generate power and you sell it to your neighbour. So you get this kind of peer-to-peer approach.
First we have to establish whether there are people who want to participate in this or not. I suppose that it is perfectly reasonable to assume that there are scores of people who don't want this approach. They don't want to be bothered with having a small power station on top of their house and having to be bothered with maintenance and dealing with technicians and paperwork, etc. Also, it is reasonable to expect that many people simply want to have their electricity and want to have it reliably. So what you are proposing is a niche market at this moment. Additionally, I wonder whether this is applicable to more than just the domestic residential market. What about industry? What about public services? What about big business? Should we force them to participate in this market? Can you assure them the reliability of baseload providing energy systems? You cannot, and it is highly unlikely that you will be able to do so in the future. Let's assume there's a storm that moves over England and it will black out the sun for 2 or 3 days. Wind speeds are excessive, and this means that wind turbines have to be shut down to prevent damage. Where does your electricity come from in those 2 or 3 days? Storage? No. It will be the Drax power plant, which will be eating US East Coast trees for quasi-green biomass energy, and those reliable and safe nuclear power stations you hate so much.
I've always believed that that's the direction of travel, that we should see this, is that people should get more control on their power. They can generate themselves, they can flog it to their neighbours, and actually we end up with a much more equitable way of generating power in the UK.
How quaint. We are talking about a luxurious fantasy which is hardly applicable to the UK, let alone the rest of the world.
So there's two things that does. There's one, you get the local money flow, so you're not spending money that's going out of the country, it's staying here in this country.
Yeah.
And that's all we do. So we don't have a conflict of interest when it comes to trying to make a decision, should we support this policy or this idea around coal, or should we support it about renewables? We only support renewables.
Right. So one of the interesting things then is, which I've thought about since I've had solar panels, is if this keeps growing, what is the role of a big energy company? I mean, presumably it does reduce, but could you be the conduit for that marketplace?
Yeah. So what I see the future as is actually we become like a peer-to-peer platform for generators and customers to kind of, almost like the eBay of energy.
Right.
So you essentially, we're no longer buying power from sort of big power stations, transporting it down big wires and giving it to you. You're saying, I've got a bit too much in this half hour, I'll give it to you, I'll find someone else to flog it to, and then somebody else might have some too much when you don't have enough, and then we make sure it works as a whole.
Now this is very ambitious, especially when we account for the fact that you will be zapping all those electrons crisscross around the country, using nothing but those big wires you just spoke about. Additionally, what will happen to the stability of the grid? What will happen to electricity prices? What will happen to those baseload providing power stations you need as backup for this micro energy trading scheme? Because that's what it is. You are trying to take down a pretty stable market and want to replace it with a highly volatile market, where reliability certainly will become an issue.
Our job becomes a completely different role, which is much lighter touch. It can be much more digitalized. And it doesn't mean you need these big companies anymore. It's people taking back their own power and us being the platform to help them do it.
Who's going to maintain the grid? A big power company. Who is going to deliver those millions upon millions of solar panels? Big corporations. Who is going to build thousands of these large wind turbines and maintain them? Right. Big power companies. Instead of buying some gas from Russia and oil from Saudi Arabia or countries of the such like, you'll be buying your rare earth magnets for your wind turbines from China. You will be importing millions upon millions of solar panels that were mass produced where? Right, also in China. Right along with all the rest of the specialized equipment. All you are doing is shifting the balance from one side of the equation to the other side. Don't make it seem that you are fighting for some kind of ideological energy freedom. Aside from that, you are the CEO of a company that has to make profit. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to hire all those people and drive that beautiful car of yours, or own a house, make a hot meal for your children. That's nothing to be ashamed of, but it is hypocritical to suppose that you are saving the people from the big baddies while you are aspiring to become one yourself. Now don't get me wrong, I'm all for low carbon emitting power sources, particularly nuclear and some renewables, but not in a scheme such as you are proposing, where expertise in maintaining a national power system that is reliable is being dismantled for a fickle energy economy.
Right, because that's, I suppose that would be a fear that many people would have is, oh God, I've got to send electricity bills to all my neighbours.
Yeah.
Each month.
But yeah, so that's kind of the concept, that each person could become a power station.
Right. So one of the key things that is frustrating and difficult is the general perception that renewables are more expensive.
Building a new nuclear power station, we've seen all the issues at Hinkley.
Yeah.
There it is. From the English perspective, it is reasonable to look at Hinkley Point and assume that this failure means that nuclear power will be impossibly expensive. However, the recent difficulties experienced by Westinghouse and Areva give us an opportunity to acknowledge that those kinds of enterprises, with those kinds of propositions, are indeed a thing of the past. Besides, Russia and China and India have their own standardized designs, which they are selling to many other countries. If the UK were honest, they would accept any of those designs, and they would be much cheaper as the one they wanted to build at Hinkley Point. Aside from that, the levelized cost of electricity for most nuclear power stations is on par with renewables and as the strongest energy source, which is most efficient in terms of material usage, should always be considered seriously when addressing carbon emissions.
Building a new coal power station, building a new gas power station, those are not cheap things.
No.
And actually, if you compare what we call the levelized cost, so that's the cost over the whole lifetime, including all the costs up front, you're getting renewables competing with new gas power.
Which is always touted as the cheapest.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the issue you've got is there's a bunch of power stations out there that paid off their investment years and years ago.
This is interesting. Power stations, particularly coal, gas and nuclear, have long operational lifespans. This gives them an edge over renewables, which need to be replaced every 25 to 30 years. So this creates an opportunity for baseload providing energy to compete while having been financed entirely and only needing operations and management cost. This is not a negative aspect, particularly if nuclear energy is concerned.
So the shape that we see of power, and I think I showed you earlier
Yeah.
what our power shape looks like, is that, so particularly with solar, you have a shape which is kind of a daytime shape,
Right.
and then you've got an early evening peak. And actually, if you chop that bit off and put it in there, you've got a really good balance.
Yeah.
This representation is far too simple. The offset that needs to come in the evening doesn't come from battery storage because there is no battery storage. And I submit to you that there won't be battery storage that could cope with such an offset either. Let's see how the Germans manage this problem. Okay, so let's check out the Agora website. Here we can see the power generation and consumption graphs for Germany. This is a Saturday. This is a Sunday. So on Saturday and Sunday, energy consumption is slightly lower than usual. Now we plot the solar bumps on the graph, and you can see there's a large discrepancy between what is required and what solar delivers. Also, you see that the curves don't match up. In the evening, there's not enough energy from solar. Also, as you can see, wind is very intermittent. You can't tell exactly when it is going to blow. So right now we are going to look at the conventional energy sources, the base load providing energy sources. So as you can see, hard coal is being used to offset the intermittency. You see it clearly in the curvature of it. So when we add solar to the mix, you can see that there's still a discrepancy between what is required and what is delivered. If we add onshore and offshore wind, we see that the graphs almost match. So the offset comes from hard coal. So now we are going to look at a 2-day graph, because this was a week graph, 7 days. So here we see again that the yellow part of the graph isn't as high as the demand side. So there's a clear discrepancy here, and you also see that the curvature doesn't match, which means that solar doesn't provide enough over the entire time. So if we add wind, we see again that it's not a lot of difference. So what does baseload providing energy do, like hydro, biomass, nuclear energy? At pump hydro, you can see that there's a slight bump together with natural gas and coal. So those are again the sources used to offset the intermittency of solar. If we analyze the data, we see that we are trying to have our electricity delivered to us with a strange priority. Baseload energy is indispensable. So much is clear. So instead we need baseload providing nuclear, load following nuclear and other sources, and solar and a little wind to deliver the rest. That would be the logical choice, rather than the other way around.
And that's what storage can do. People like you are great, because actually you need people like you to start the curve off.
Yeah.
It's not mainstream yet in terms of the pricing for it, but early adopters and people who generate a lot of power in their own home, probably it's getting to a place where it's a good thing to have.
Yeah.
But people who, if they're exporting a lot during the day and they've got a big installation, batteries are not far off.
A couple of things here. First, battery technology is old. Yes, we are seeing a lot of innovative ideas, but we are not going to solve the power density issue. In fact, the current lithium-ion battery has quite a high energy density when a battery is concerned. We can gain some efficiency here and there, but let's face it, batteries for electric vehicles alone is going to be a tremendous problem that goes all the way back to the mines where essential ingredients need to be extracted. Secondly, and this is very important, you are talking about bridging a gap. Robert Llewellyn obviously is an early adopter. Those first 10% are easy. Those are people who come running towards you screaming for your technology. Then, however, you need to get market penetration, which means that you need to bridge the gap. It is a problem everyone has. Even Elon Musk is facing these issues with his home batteries and solar tiles. Bridging the gap is not just a matter of getting enough consumers. It's also surviving increasing stress on raw material production and increased manufacture capabilities. If either of those don't follow up on the increased demand after you've bridged the gap, your technology will remain a niche market and will never become mainstream, which is something grid storage batteries won't do because we do not produce enough lithium, cobalt, graphite and a host of other materials to facilitate the jump required to close the gap.
Is it conceivable in your mind then, not possibly even in our lifetimes, but that the UK could be 100% powered by renewables?
Oh yeah.
Is that,
I mean, technologically, completely. So we've got the resources. We've got 40% of Europe's wind resource in this country.
It does not logically follow that if you have the resource of wind that you can capture it. To capture it, you need to build wind turbines first. You need about 350 terawatt hours of electricity in a year, which is not the equivalent of energy, by the way. Suppose 50% of that would come from wind. That's 175 terawatt hours per year. 1,000 megawatt of wind turbines generate about 2.6 terawatt hours a year. In 2015, you generated about 41 terawatt hours, which means you need to close the gap of 134 terawatt hours. You add an average of 1,500 megawatts or 3.9 terawatt hours to the grid each year. So by that reckoning, it would take you 34 years to get there. Now this in itself is pretty darn good. I won't pretend that it isn't good. However, if you zoom out from England and look at the wider world, you see that England's electricity usage is about 1% of the entire electricity consumption of the planet, which isn't that crazy because you also have 1% of the world's population. Suppose we want to get half of our electricity from wind in a world context. It starts to become an entirely different picture. Currently, we add about 166 terawatt hours worth of generation capacity to the energy mix of the world. We need roughly 12,500 terawatt hours. So by that reckoning, it would take us almost 70 years to get that done. But it gets worse because if we would only do electricity, we would still be in big trouble because we don't use 25,000 terawatt hours of energy, but 250,000 terawatt hours by 2040, according to the US Energy Information Administration. At today's build rate, we would be building wind turbines for 7 centuries before we could decarbonize half of our 2040 predicted energy demand. And that's not taking into consideration the 30-year lifespan of each wind turbine unit. So electricity is quite cute, but when we are talking energy, it is insignificant. Thermal processes and transportation simply dwarf electricity in terms of fossil fuel consumption. And that's why this whole discussion about wind and solar is merely a distraction from the greater problem. The Brits may be able to do it on wind like the Scots have done it, or the Danes have done it, not entirely by the way. However, without decent storage technologies, they will be creating a lot of problems, and storage is a real problem. So yes, you English people may have some luxury and luck, but I'm confident that the rest of the world isn't as lucky as you guys are, and that is something I am not happy about. While you are dreaming about a 100% renewable England, the rest of the world is hungry and thirsty and suffering. Do you have a solution for these people as well? I propose that renewables and nuclear finally start working together as they should. And you should take an example in it, which is something you should be advocating for as well.
Everybody's lining up to try and figure out what their role is in storage right now. And everybody's trying to figure out how they're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
So storage isn't free. How come levelized cost of electricity of renewables is so low? Because storage and offsets aren't a consideration in the calculations. So in the case of Germany, for instance, the offset coal burning they do should be considered a cost element of their renewables. In the US, where renewable intermittency is offset by gas burning, that portion of gas being burned and the cost along with it should be factored in with renewable costs and should be part of their levelized cost of electricity as well. And the same goes for batteries and storage. Do you think those are cheap? They should be factored in too. Aside from that, do you know if we can build enough of them? Any idea what kind of increase in material production should be made in order to facilitate the growth of a grid battery scheme of any meaning? That's what I always see when watching these kinds of videos. Everyone is fantasizing about an energy future without really factoring in the costs of actually building that infrastructure, beginning with getting the commodities required in the first place.
They're also slightly waking on government because government's sort of messing around with a couple of the rules that affect it. So we kind of need a clear steer from government as that they're going to leave some stuff alone and maybe improve some stuff. Because it's not so much about subsidy that you need necessarily on storage, it's you need clarity and you need to be able to access a lot of the benefits that the system would normally pay for, but you can't always get access to unless you're a big power station. So there's some things that need unpicking that we're talking to them about at the moment.
Now, I occasionally get the kind of angry tweet, saying, "Oh, you and your subsidised renewables," and I'm going, "Well, I know that there is rather
all technologies are subsidised.
All technologies.
All technologies should receive some form of subsidy anyway, since it is imperative that we leave the fossil fuels in the ground. We need to incentivize low-carbon energy solutions. However, we do have to remain clear on what the goal is. 100% renewable is not a correct goal. 100% fossil-free, however, is. The emphasis should be on getting rid of harmful emissions which cause economic damage and hurt people and the biosphere.
And all energy sources are subsidised.
I'm just about to write a blog, 2.5 billion into the oil and gas industry this year.
Right.
The first place they went to visit, first place the new Secretary of State went to visit was Aberdeen. So I'm not quite sure what that 2.5 billion is unless it's a subsidy.
Yeah.
Because it is a subsidy.
It is a subsidy, right.
Yes. And if you look at the old DEC, so the old DEC's, I think it's about 80 to 90% of the old DEC's budget.
So DEC is Department of
Department of Energy and Climate Change.
Right.
So it's not valid, that stat now, as it's part of BASE, but where it was originally, it was 80 or 90% of that budget was on nuclear decommissioning.
Right. Wow. Which is what, because that's one of my.
So whose subsidy is that?
It's the government paying for the decommissioning of power plants which they have built themselves. All the commercially owned power plants pay for their own decommissioning, which is paid for by the consumer, which is factored into the cost of electricity, which is still pretty cheap. Now, a friend of mine wrote this in response to my previous video. Let me put it bluntly. DEC was the wrong name for the department that took care of this. It should have been a cost for the Ministry of Defence. In the UK, all DEC decommissioning costs are for weapons site and shot Magnox reactors. Cost for decommissioning other power reactors like the pressurized water reactor and the AGR is solely the responsibility of the owners. EDF owns all maintaining power reactors. EDF have a fund growing annually for this mandated by the UK government. It's a kind of tax, about 5% revenue. This is how decommissioning is handled in all Western democracies I know of. So what you are talking about has nothing to do with civilian power plants and everything to do with Cold War era technology that has become obsolete, irrelevant, and isn't being used anymore, but is owned by your country in the first place. So you, the taxpayer, have to pay for it. But it has nothing to do with civilian nuclear power.